Hey there, Chris here from Military Aviation History, and I'm sure you have also heard of the most recent bombardment that Ukraine has sustained by the hand of Russian cruise missiles starting on October 10th. And this has caused me to think a little bit more in terms of cruise missiles, what they can do, what they cannot do, why they are so prominent in Ukraine right now, and what their role was throughout the campaign, what they can do, what they cannot do, and of course also what European countries, NATO, the US should take away from this. So in order to answer those questions and have a chat about it, I've invited Justin Bronk, once again from the Royal United Services Institute. He's been a regular on the channel since, well, I believe summer last year, so most of you will know him. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right, Justin, thanks very much for being back on the channel. Now, first of all, congratulations on getting your PhD. We'll have to all call you Dr. Bronk now, from now on.
Oh yeah, I'll insist. Refuse to appear on any videos without it.
Well, then in that case, Dr. Bronk, could you obviously we've seen a couple of developments in Ukraine now. Ukraine obviously destroying partially the bridge into Crimea. Then their recent attack from Russia shooting cruise missiles into Ukraine. So I just want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about it, how the Russians are using cruise missiles and what cruise missiles are generally used for, and then also how you would defend yourself against them. But to put everybody on the same page, what are actually cruise missiles?
So a cruise missile is a missile that cruises using aerodynamic lift created by wings and a propulsion system, which is almost always a small turbojet. So jet powered, they're often, if they're launched from ships or from surface, so ground launchers, they tend to have a rocket booster to kind of get them going, get them up to speed where the turbojet can then work to give them a more efficient, so a small jet gives you a much more efficient fuel capacity to range equation than rockets. But rockets obviously offer a huge amount more thrust up front. So if they're air launched, then they're just typically dropped, and then they're already at a high enough speed for the turbojet to take over and provide enough thrust to cruise, then using the wings that then kind of pop out. And yeah, if they're also regularly launched from particularly surface ships and submarines. So they'll be packed into a tube or sometimes launched from a torpedo tube. And then once they're out, the rocket booster will get them up to flying speed, and the wings will pop out and the booster will drop away, and then they'll fly to their targets. Typically, 500 miles plus as a range. They tend to be limited by in terms of export, versions tend to be limited in terms of treaties, but well over 500 miles would be typical for most Russian and indeed high-end Western cruise missiles.
How do they sort of differ also in the delivery compared to ballistic missiles then?
So a ballistic missile, as the name suggests, flies on a ballistic trajectory. So it is fired up by a rocket motor, reaches a very high speed at a very high angle, and then essentially curves around in a ballistic arc and comes down. So by varying the angle, and therefore how high the apogee is, you can change the kind of distance that the missile flies. The more modern Russian cruise missile, ballistic missiles, so particularly the Iskander-M, will fly what we call a quasi-ballistic trajectory. So it comes in ballistically, so at a much higher speed and a much higher angle than a cruise missile. But instead of just kind of dropping straight down, it can undertake sort of a degree of maneuvers coming in to make it more difficult to intercept. Ballistic missiles are typically larger and more expensive than cruise missiles for a given range and a given payload, but the payoff is that they are much harder to intercept, and because they fly much faster. It is also, though, easier to detect the launch of a ballistic missile early than a cruise missile, because the very high trajectory means that even if you have a ground-based radar early warning system as opposed to an airborne one, the curvature of the Earth doesn't limit you nearly as much in detection range terms if you're looking at a very, very high target, because as the Earth kind of curves away, if you imagine a radar, then the shadow of where you can't see because the curvature of the Earth is much closer to you the lower the altitude of the thing you're looking at. So cruise missiles, because they typically fly somewhere between 50 and 500 feet, they can obviously cruise much higher. But if they're being programmed to fly into a defended area, then they'll generally fly between about 50 and 250 feet. That means that ground-based surface-to-air missiles or other kind of radars will not generally detect them until they're quite close, because of the clutter effect of any sort of terrain, things like forests, but also just the curvature of the Earth.
And you already mentioned sort of the ballistic missile Iskander-M. Now there's Iskander-K, which I believe defines as a cruise missile. Is that correct?
It is. So it's a slightly messy definition in the sense that, technically speaking, Iskander-K is the name typically ascribed to the cruise missile that the Iskander-M can fire. So that the Iskander-M system, or what we in the West typically refer to as Iskander-M, is a sort of, can fire two different kinds of missiles. A lot of Russian missile launch systems can accommodate different missiles within the canisters. So the ballistic missile it fires, we refer to as the Iskander-M, and the cruise missile, the Iskander-K, they're both capable of being fired from the same system. And yeah, they are some of the most modern, certainly ground-launched systems that Russia has in its long-range precision fires arsenal. And
they seem to have quite a plethora of different systems that they're using. So there's Caliber, which seems to be more mainly sea-based, K-101 or 101, depending on how you want to say it, which seems to be their most modern air-launched system. Is that correct?
Yes. So it's certainly the KH-101 is the most capable air-launched cruise missile that they typically use. It does have radar cross-section reduction features, so it's somewhat stealthy. It's got a better circular area probable, so it's more accurate than the older Calibers or clubs. And it also has two versions. So the KH-101 is the conventional version. The KH-102 is the nuclear version. They're the same missile in effect, but one is designed for nuclear payload and the other is not. Those are typically dropped from the Tu-95 or Tu-160 strategic bombers. So they can carry multiples internally on rotary launchers, as well as for the Tu-95s on external pylons. Yeah, they typically fly and fire salvos of these things. There's quite a small production rate of KH-101s and 102s. And Russia had already used quite a number of them in Syria for basically prestige reasons. I mean, there was no target that required those weapons, but this is now an issue for them in Ukraine because they're coming up against they're coming up close to their own comfort levels in terms of the contingency stocks that they feel they need to keep for these, particularly the higher end cruise missiles like KH-101 and ballistic missiles like Iskander-M, that they feel they need to keep for a NATO contingency. I don't know what the exact kind of ratio is in terms of, do they think they have to keep 50% of their stocks for a contingency? Do they think they have to keep 60%, 40%? I don't know what that number is, but what we do know is that from looking at the patterns of employment, what they're firing at when, and the fact that they're using a lot of other missiles that are not designed to do cruise and ballistic missiles jobs, but to do those jobs. So particularly they're using S-300 long-range surface-to-air missiles in the land attack role. They've used SA-17 medium-range surface-to-air missiles in the land attack role. They've used quite a lot of older anti-ship missiles, and indeed also quite a number of the most modern P-800 Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles, again, to attack land targets, particularly just hitting cities in the south, so Odessa, Mykolaiv. But that's a really inefficient use of, particularly in the case of the P-800, very expensive and quite limited stocks of anti-ship missiles. So the fact that they're doing that and have been doing that for many months now heavily suggests that they are very close to their own comfort limits in terms of how many of their traditional cruise and ballistic missiles they've expended. We saw this sort of hissy fit, for want of a better word, after the Kerch Bridge attack. where they fired, I think, 85 cruise and ballistic missiles, mostly cruise missiles, as well as a number of the Shahed 136 and 131 loitering munitions from Iran. Most of them were targeting infrastructure, so they're mostly going after power stations, the grid, so things like substations, and that is part of a strategy that was already being planned and had been worked on before the Kerch Bridge attacks. That as winter comes on, they're trying to put the pain on Ukrainian citizens by smashing up the power grid. It's also a way of putting more pressure on Europe, in the sense that Ukraine had been exporting a significant amount of electricity to Europe until this week, because Ukraine has a large amount of nuclear capacity. It's not linked to gas, and even with some of its plants occupied by the Russians, they still had enough to export a significant amount of electricity to Europe, which was helping to keep the issues from the withdrawal from Russian gas down. So, those attacks are another way of pressuring Europe, as well as causing more suffering among Ukrainian people. But they also attacked a number of cultural sites, so the plexiglass bridge in Kyiv, as well as targeting a number of buildings which have cultural significance to Ukrainians. And, whether by design or because there was electronic warfare interference with the terminal homing of those missiles, or because they just failed to accurately hit exactly what they were targeted at, they also hit a number of just intersections in the middle of the city, a play park in one of the suburbs of Kyiv, none of which are a good use of, from a military point of view, of increasingly scarce high-end cruise missiles. But it's interesting that kind of hissy fit has not been sustained. There's still strikes going on, but it's at a much lower level. They just don't have the stocks left to keep up that sort of rate of punitive bombardment.
And you already talked a little bit sort of about the accuracy and what exact targets are being hit. I mean, how does the guidance of cruise missiles actually work? I mean, in the West we have GPS. Now the Russians have their own GLONASS GPS system equivalent. But since these cruise missiles are coming at low altitude, at high speeds, the variance of an error, I mean, we've seen this in the past as well, with them hitting sort of right beside the probably intended target. And so how does the accuracy in sort of the guidance work there?
So cruise missiles typically have multiple interleaved guidance mechanisms. So they will all have an inertial guidance system. So I don't know if any of the viewers have seen the sort of now famously memed video explaining how the missile knows where it is by knowing where it isn't and measuring the difference between where it isn't and where it is. Essentially, the alignment is given at point of launch from either the launch aircraft or launch ship or vehicle, so that the missile knows where it is when it's fired, and having aligned before it's fired and then been fired with a fixed point of knowing where it is, it will then use gyroscopes inside to measure acceleration and velocity and heading internally, and basically therefore plot a rough course on a kind of internal map. Now, various kinds of cruise missiles around the world will have something called TERCOM, which is terrain contour matching. So they would have a seeker on board, generally a radar seeker, although sometimes EO, so electro-optical or infrared, which can look for features on the ground, so things like railway bridges or rivers, or things that show up quite easily, to kind of look for waypoints that would show up on the internal mapping software, or the sort of flight plan, if you like, that has been pre-programmed in, and therefore check for error, because the longer you fly on an inertial navigation system, the more error will creep in over time. And so TERCOM equipped missiles will use that terrain contour matching to check and update their exact position against where they, roughly speaking, think they are along the route, and pilots would do the same. So old school late Cold War low-level nav for fast jets, where there was an inertial navigation system. A lot of what would be done would be for aircraft that would be to take a radar fix, using the radar to look for key points on the ground, or flying over key points and noting it manually, and then inserting that as a known location at a known time into the nav system to update it and kind of cancel out any drift. So an INS system will one of the measures of how good an inertial navigation system is would be the drift over time since the last position update. And then, as you mentioned, most cruise missiles, including Western ones and in fact Russian ones as well, use GPS. The Russians do have their own GLONASS equivalent, and there's also the Chinese Beidou. GLONASS has not been working as well for the Russians as they'd like for precision applications, so they've actually been relying quite heavily on GPS, which has limited the practical ability to jam it at all times. GPS can be spoofed, can be jammed, but the Russians also rely on it, so they can't do it the whole time. And also, if you're using a GPS or GLONASS coordinate point for your kind of terminal attack, if there are electronic warfare systems near the target area, then they might be able to push that missile slightly off course by just introducing a small error by interfering with the GPS or GLONASS signal. Equally, though, a lot of cruise missiles, not many of the Russian ones, but cruise missiles will often, particularly modern Western ones, have an imaging seeker as well. So they will use INS, GPS. Some of them can even use astral navigation. So the Trident system, for example, the nuclear deterrent missile for the UK and the US uses astral fixing. So it can look at the stars and use that to update positional points in the absence of GPS. But then in the terminal phase, they will use a camera system essentially to look for and match an image of the expected target. Now, of course, that requires you to have an image to begin with of what the target looks like. So it's increasing the dependency there on good intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance, ISTAR. And in the Russian case, they may well often just be firing at sort of GPS points or grid points or known buildings using satellite targeting. And for relatively generic looking buildings, for example, imaging matching may not be possible there even for missiles that have it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the error point just from flying fast and low, most cruise missiles and Russian missiles, there's footage of them doing it and going into Kyiv on Monday. They will tend to fly in at low level, but then they'll often pop up and then come straight down, so that they're it's generally so that they avoid hitting other buildings or terrain around the target, but also to help them fine-tune accuracy. That's a mode that can be turned on and off, because if there's a really, for example, if you're attacking a very well defended target, that may increase the vulnerability in the terminal phase more than you'd like. But equally, for example, some anti-ship missiles have a pop-up and come down mode in the terminal attack phase, because most ship-based defense systems struggle to engage targets directly above. And so yeah, there's all sorts of different maneuvers and capabilities that cruise and anti-ship missiles have. One notable issue for using anti-ship missiles in the land attack role is that they have generally a radar seeker. And so, for example, the Russian attack on the shopping mall a few months ago that killed a large number of civilians, that was an anti-ship missile. It wasn't aimed at the shopping mall, it was aimed at a target nearby, but the seeker head, it being an anti-ship missile, having flown to the right grid point, turned on, saw the large metal roof of a shopping center and thought, "Oh, there's the biggest ship I've ever seen. That's magnificent." And so went straight into that. So, again, where you see claims around Russian missiles having very poor accuracy, generally speaking, that's not what I've seen. What I've seen is where missiles are being used for their intended purpose, they're generally fairly accurate. Where there are Ukrainian electronic warfare assets that are protecting key infrastructure, they may be able to induce an error. But in the absence of that sort of defense, generally they're fairly accurate. But where the Russians are using missiles that are not designed as land attack munitions, then clearly there is a significant accuracy problem there. And it's certainly not to suggest that they're not still liable for all the damage they're causing. It's still the Russians firing this stuff in. Yeah.
What about sort of the countermeasures to the countermeasures? So if the Ukrainians are using electronic warfare against these cruise missiles, do cruise missiles carry any sort of decoys or electronic warfare systems that allow them to overcome these?
Cruise missiles, generally speaking, don't. The normal route to try and overcome defense systems for cruise missiles is to have multiple seeker capability, multiple aiming functions. So you have an INS function or an imaging function as well as your GPS or GLONASS function. So you're trying to reduce dependency on any single thing that might be jammed or interfered with. Generally, they'll be fired in salvos. So and the route mapping will be planned to try and avoid known defenses. So Russian cruise missiles have been observed making up to 80 different turn points in flight. So that they're clearly capable of fairly sophisticated mission planning to try and avoid threats. Take advantage of terrain, for example, to fly down valleys. And again, US TLAMs have been doing that since the Gulf War. And so, there are those sort of tactics. And then having been fired in salvos, if it's a well-defended area, the target area, then you might expect the cruise missiles to be programmed to come in from different directions almost simultaneously, because that makes defending against them that much harder. Ballistic missiles, some of them do carry decoys. And also, as I said, the more advanced ones like the Iskander-M can not only release radar decoys, but can also conduct some limited maneuvers in the terminal phase, which, coupled with coming in from a very steep angle and very fast, makes them extremely difficult to intercept. So where you see ranges quoted for air defense systems, for example, S-300 V1, for example, one of the most capable things the Ukrainians have at the moment, you might see ranges quoted for how big an area they can protect, but the range against fixed wing targets will be an amount, for argument's sake, we'll say 100, 125, 150 kilometers, let's say. That would be against a relatively high flying, relatively unaware, relatively slow target. Then if you're talking about a fighter that's likely to do defensive maneuvers and have a radar warning receiver, and you might be talking 75 kilometers. And then if you were talking about something flying low, maybe 250 feet, like a cruise missile or a fighter, even if it's coming directly towards you, just because the limits of the radar horizon, unless you're able to use third-party radar data, so receive target data in real time that is sufficiently high resolution and compatible to launch with, typically you're looking then at maybe 40 kilometers or less, just because the clutter in the radar horizon makes it difficult. But if you're looking at a ballistic missile, actually you're looking at a much smaller area, again, maybe 5 kilometers or 10, because the incoming missile is so fast that even assuming it doesn't successfully decoy the interceptor, the lock-on that's guiding the interceptor, and doesn't employ sophisticated terminal maneuvers, the interceptor that you're firing at to try and intercept that cruise missile has to fly so fast and cover distance so quickly to kind of get into an intercept position for that incoming round, that the ability to do that is limited to an area really quite close to the launcher. And so often for air defense systems, that's why you see quoted engagement ranges of X against air breathing targets, and maybe a quarter as much against ballistic threats.
So given that these recent attacks, I mean, you've already mentioned there were sort of 80 to 85 missiles being fired off on October the 10th. Now, obviously, this might still be a developing situation now as well. We're on Friday, October the 14th, where we're actually having this call. But from these 80 to 85 missiles that were fired, the Ukrainians claim roughly half of them shot down. First of all, how accurate could these claims be? And second, how do you actually defend against cruise missiles? I've seen, I think, one video of an alleged man-pad shooting one down. You said radar-guided, of course, air defense also works, but it has very limited range and time to react. So how does it work?
So there's a few ways. So in terms of the claimed roughly 50% intercept rate, that's actually fairly consistent with what we've been seeing in terms of when we've had access to Ukrainian internal data. 40 to 60%, depending on the target area and how much early warning they get, is roughly what they're averaging against cruise missiles at the moment. That's up significantly from the first months of the war, when first of all, Ukraine had lost a large amount of its early warning radar capabilities from Russian strikes on the 24th of February. The apparatus for getting early warning from external sources and from long-range radars to the air defenses themselves really wasn't particularly efficient. And so the improvements there, not only in the deployment of defenses and slowly over time, perhaps the number of defenses as well, but the critical thing that's really improved has been that information flow, the networks, the architectures and the processes to get early warning data from by both external sources and internal long-range radars to those air defense assets, so that if they are in the rough flight path of those incoming weapons, they are on, ready and looking in the right direction, because particularly for low-flying cruise missiles, there is a very, very short engagement window in most cases, particularly for short-range systems. So the shoot down that looks to have happened with an Igla manpad that you mentioned is incredibly difficult to do, and is only possible either, in this case, probably because the previous earlier missiles fired in the same salvo had probably already gone over that position, and so they were ready, waiting to see if there are any more, or if you had received early warning information saying there is a flight of cruise missiles coming in from roughly this bearing to roughly that bearing, be on alert, and if you see any, shoot them down, because it takes time to spin up these systems. So for a manpad, you need to get the battery warmed up, you need to have it all set up and ready to fire with nobody in the back blast and it not in its crate on the ground, for radar guided SAMs, the Ukrainians have to be careful anywhere near the front lines, at least, with keeping their radars on for a long period, because it will allow them to be located and potentially also be hit with standoff anti-radiation missiles, the KH-31Ps. And so having that early warning is absolutely critical. They've also been flying cruise missile interception sorties with MiG-29 and Sukhoi-27. That's a very difficult thing to do, but it is doable. They have had successes consistently throughout the war. But again, absolutely crucial to have decent early warning and a rough idea of where those missiles are coming from what bearing, on what heading, and roughly at what time, particularly for the MiG-29, because the MiG-29 has very short range. So you can't patrol for hours waiting for the cruise missiles to come through an area. You have to know pretty well where they're coming from. Luckily, in that sense, the two major sources of cruise missile attacks in terms of launch platforms are the Tu-95s, which, because they're based out of Engels, where all the Russian bomber force sits, Engels is pretty heavily surveilled. It's the seat of one of the legs of Russia's nuclear triad, so there's a huge amount of surveillance on it. And so, the loading of cruise missiles onto bombers will be generally observed, and the departures are likely to be observed as well. Equally, the other main source is naval launches from the Black Sea, most of which should take place in international waters. And there's a lot of Western surveillance aircraft orbits in international waters in the Black Sea. So that doesn't really help much for people living in Nikolaev or Odessa or places like that, because the warning time is still very short. But if you're talking about targets much deeper into Ukraine, the ability to provide that information to say to the Ukrainians, well, there appears to be a launch going on in this grid. We don't know exactly what the target is, but there are launches going on. That can then allow the Ukrainians to queue in their own sensors and then to try and sequence defense options. It's worth noting, of course, that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. There are an enormous number of potential targets that they have to defend, not least their own troops on 1,000 kilometers plus of front line. which are under regular attack from Russian helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft on occasion. It's not necessarily terribly accurate attack most of the time, but that is because of the air defense threat that the Ukrainians are able to pose to those sorties, that they have to be very cautious. So the Ukrainians do have to protect the front line, and a lot of their shorter range systems are deployed there. So, for example, the German Gepards are almost entirely being used on the front lines. Equally, a lot of the SA-11s, so the medium-range SAMs that have been Ukraine's most effective air defense asset during the war, are largely, or at least have been largely, they're mobile, so this can change, but have been largely protecting forward areas and troops, whereas the long-range systems, the S-300 PS, PT, and V batteries have largely been protecting cities and key infrastructure, so have been mostly conducting counter-cruise missile and occasionally counter-ballistic missile duties.
On the Ukrainian side, the US has sort of pledged the support with NASAMS. The UK has recently also said, because of the attacks on the cities, they're going to be donating or selling. I'm not quite sure on the details. New missiles, and then of course Germany has, I believe, on Tuesday delivered the first IRIS-T SL launchers to Ukraine. How are those weapons going to augment Ukrainians' air defense systems, considering that I think the US is still, at least the last update I saw was from September, so before these recent attacks, still saying that they're not going to be sending anything for the next month or so. Of course, that might change.
So I think the US have expedited the first 2 NASAMS systems.
Okay.
And there's going to be another 8, I think it's 8 delivered next year.
Okay.
Early next year. I mean, the basic issue is that the West has systemically ignored the need for medium and short range air defense among its own units, because the West has been fighting wars for the past 20 years in which it had total air superiority. And so it just wasn't something that we invested much in. And as a result, the essential bottleneck on how fast things like IRIS-T SLM and NASAMS can be delivered is how fast they can be built, because there just really aren't many of them about. And so, how will they perform? Probably very well. They're both roughly in the same category as SA-11 in terms of what the Ukrainians are currently using. They're medium-range air defense systems. They're likely to have a slightly higher probability of kill. They are firing an active seeker missile, the AMRAAM, so terminal guidance is less critical in terms of maintaining a single target track type lock. There's significant advantages there. From a logistics point of view, it's important because there is a limit to how many rounds of Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles the West can source and supply to Ukraine. Ukraine does make some of them itself, but not many. And so, in much the same way as part of the reason for trying to help the Ukrainian forces transition across to NATO howitzers as fast as possible is not just that they're more effective than their Soviet equivalents, but that we don't have any more 152 millimeter ammunition to supply, and therefore helping the Ukrainians transition to 155, which we can build and supply, is a critical thing for the medium term. The air defense picture is similar, and so Britain saying, for example, that they're going to donate AMRAAM is typically an air-to-air missile. Well, it is an air-to-air missile, but it is fired by NASAMS, and so the fact that NASAMS fires an air-to-air missile, of which NATO has thousands, will be very helpful from a long-term logistics point of view of being able to keep Ukrainian air defense supplied with ammunition. On the other hand, there's a limited number of systems we can send, and the build rate is probably just about sufficient to replace capacity that is either being destroyed or always running out of ammunition permanently. It's not going to cause a massive uplift, and even if it did, there's no way to protect all of Ukraine from cruise missile and ballistic missile attack, let alone Shaheds. Just as if one wants to look at what a really high-end layered air defense system looks like, one would look at the Israelis, who have built an extremely impressive multi-layered system, the Iron Dome being the most famous, but that's the sort of lower end of the system. Then you have David Sling and Arrow and Patriot PAC-3 going up through the kind of categories. all integrated into a very, very comprehensive sensor and command and control network. That has cost untold billions and taken decades to build, more than a decade to build. And it's defending a country that is extremely geographically small compared to Ukraine, and against which the threat vectors are well known. So you know where the threats are coming from. And even then, one of the key component sort of parts of how the Iron Dome system works is that it has the sufficient discrimination and predictive tracking capabilities to work out which missiles, incoming missiles or rockets, are going to land in unpopulated areas, and it ignores them to save interceptors. Because even with all of that investment and all of that prioritization and all of those layers, the system is not 100% effective. And so you try and read across to talking about a sky shield for Ukraine. It's impossible to provide anything close to what, for example, Iron Dome provides the Israelis. Not to mention that the quality of the incoming threats, particularly the ballistic threats, are massively higher in the case of what the Russians can fire into Ukraine versus what Hezbollah or even the Iranians can fire into Israel. But again, the biggest point just being the sheer geographical spread of all the different towns, cities, infrastructure targets, forces, military installations, bases, everything that Ukraine has to try and protect. The flip side to all of that, not wanting to sound too doom and gloomy, is long-range precision strike and indeed punitive bombardment as a whole has a 0% success rate in terms of delivering strategic decisive effect. There is no case of a country succumbing to strategic bombardment in a punitive sense. You can argue possibly about Milosevic, but even there was a heavy threat of an imminent ground invasion. And it wasn't the punitive effect that caused it, there was political discussion. So the idea that even if they had no more air defense, that the Ukrainians would somehow be cowed into being forced to negotiate or surrender or something by Russian long-range attacks is just fantasy. It's pure revenge at this point from the Russians. It's not going to break the Ukrainian will, and it's also poor use from a military point of view of relatively scarce strike assets.
A little bit of a technical question with the US NASAMS delivery. I assume that's going to be NASAMS 2.
It will be NASAMS 2,
yeah. Okay.
But not the ER version, I don't think.
Yeah, okay. I expected as much. For sort of as a closing question of maybe what Europe can take away from this. Of course, in Europe, we sort of have this Sky Shield initiative, especially in Germany, we hear a lot about it. What is sort of your take on this, given the already stated sort of deficiency with NATO air defense and specifically also, air defense in European countries?
In rebuilding deterrence by denial capability and capacity in Europe, which we need to do. The Russians will rearm over the next 3 to 5 years, regardless of how Ukraine turns out. They have no choice. And the Chinese will help them because it's in their geostrategic interest for Russia to continue to pose a military threat to Europe. What we need is deterrence by punishment has failed in this case, particularly in Ukraine, i.e. don't do this because you will suffer. The Russians seem perfectly happy to take that gamble, albeit they've taken far, far higher losses for far lower gains than they could possibly have imagined. But the takeaway for Eastern European member states in particular is pretty clear, which is we know what happens now when Russian troops take our territory, or what would happen when they take territory, because we've seen it in Bucha, we've seen it in Izium, we've seen it in unfortunately systemically across the areas that Russia has occupied in Ukraine. And so Eastern European member states in NATO, quite understandably, are being pretty clear about saying we do not want to be traded for time in any future clash. We want forward forces that are capable of deterrence by denial, i.e. there is no opportunity for you to exploit, rather than deterrence by punishment, which is if you do something, we will eventually impose huge cost on you. That requires a degree of conventional credibility in military terms, and will increasingly require the European states, including the UK, to be able to demonstrate that with much less reliance on the US, because one of the notable features of US movements in this conflict is that they have been extremely restrained with what they've actually sent to Europe in terms of additional units, particularly Air Force units. We haven't seen B-2 deployments, we haven't seen F-22 deployments, we haven't seen large movements of strike assets or anything else across. We've seen some interesting signaling, but it's been quite limited. And the majority of the work done by the USAF has been with assets already in Europe. So to me, that would be a message that is aimed quite squarely at European allies and NATO allies, is saying, don't expect us to suddenly bomb in huge amounts of additional capacity in future, because we may not be able to. And in this conflict, the indicator was one of the first real concerns in the initial months, after it became clear that Ukraine wasn't going to fall immediately, is China going to use this opportunity to do something in Taiwan? Mm-hmm. And so you actually saw a significant reinforcement of Indo-PACOM by the US. If Europe is therefore to get serious again, for want of a better term, about conventional deterrence, we need to have a credible means of evading Russian long-range precision strike capabilities against key military assets. Long-range precision strike against cities is probably not something that can be really defended against. There's just too many potential targets. But the Western military instrument, particularly the air instrument, is very dependent on a few very vulnerable nodes. In pursuit of efficiency, cost efficiency, we have centralized things across NATO and a smaller and smaller number of main operating bases and large combined air operations center type command facilities. And so, key targets for any Russian Russian long-range precision fires assets in any future clash would be things like Ramstein, Mildenhall, Lakenheath, Coningsby, Marham, Lossiemouth, all of these main operating bases where there are multiple types of aircraft, huge amounts of combat capability, but no air defense. Ramstein has some air defense, but the rest of them don't. Now, there are two kind of approaches to dealing with that. And the same goes for, army bases, for example. The divisional warfighting construct essentially within NATO relies on a core support area where an army corps led by the US with NATO allies filling in kind of formations within it would establish a large divisional support in core support areas with these large depots. And, again, those will be obvious targets for long-range precision strikes. We either need to disperse them. So in the air domain, that means going back to regular practice, dispersing both aircraft and maintenance kit and munitions and things and the sort of security elements required to protect them to either older military bases that are no longer used for frontline ops, or to perhaps civilian airports for practice, or even rough strips. The Swedes and the Finns do this a lot as a sort of standard matter of course. But it's an expensive thing that your Air Force has to be built around doing. The USAF does something called Agile Combat Employment, ACE, which involves 2 or 4 ships going to smaller bases or even occasionally highway strips. But then the US has the luxury of being able to fly in C-5s or C-17s worth of support equipment and supplies with a small detachment of fighters, do some stuff, refuel them, have a couple of sorties, and then move elsewhere. Most European countries are not set up to be able to do that sort of thing. And so if you decide dispersal is the way to go, that will require investment. But that does offer a significant potential way out of sort of systemic vulnerability to Russian long-range precision strike, because Russia doesn't have unlimited launch platforms and its targeting cycle is relatively slow. So if you can move fairly regularly and present a large number of different targets, especially if you can credibly threaten the launch platforms, it makes it less of an attractive potential trade-off. Let's say 16 cruise missiles going into a main operating base, if it's fully occupied, might be worth the loss of the launch platform. Mm-hmm. But if it's 4 against 4 different targets that may or may not be occupied, and you're going to lose that launch aircraft, then actually suddenly that may not be the right trade-off. But if you decide you can't do that, then the other option is layered air defense. And so what the Norwegians, for example, are doing is, as they move to the F-35, they are closing Bodø, which is one of their main fighter bases, the 2 remaining ones, and they're moving everything to a single main operating base, with the reasoning that they can afford to put a layered air defense system around one main operating base, but not more. So even though they're then concentrated on one target, as it were, at least that target will have proper protection in terms of short range, medium range, long range systems. Yeah, those are the kind of two main approaches: dispersal or hardening. And a lot of NATO air forces don't have either. And of course, a lot of ground-based air defense systems that do exist, Germany, for example, does actually have more than most. They have Patriot and have been producing the IRIS-T system slowly, as well as things like Gepard still in the inventory. But most of them are operated by the army. And so it's not to say that that's a bad thing or a good thing, but it does affect the prioritization potentially of how those assets are commanded, where they are placed, where they're most needed. For something as expensive as Patriot, that's probably less of an issue because they're seen as strategic assets. But either there needs to be more joint coordination for limited air defense assets, or potentially, for example, to protect air assets, you might have to have the air forces have their own ground-based air defenses. So yeah, there's some interesting institutional stuff under there as well.
Justin, or Dr. Bronk, thank you very much for that roundup. We went from cruise missiles all the way to lessons to take out of this conflict, of course, for NATO. So thanks very much for sharing your thoughts, and it's been a pleasure as always.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching, and thank you very much to all the members and Patreons for their support. And as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.